Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us today for NCSL's 2013 Top Issues webinar series. My name is John Kuhl, Public Affairs and Media Manager at the National Conference of State Legislatures. Each year, NCSL develops a list of the most pressing and important concerns on state legislative agendas. Today we have a panel of NCSL fiscal experts who will be discussing sequestration, the federal budget, the fiscal cliff, and how all this will impact states. Our experts include NCSL Senior Federal Affairs Counsel Michael Byrd, who has been with NCSL for 28 years, and NCSL Senior Policy Specialist Jeff Hurley, who has been with NCSL for 4 years. Today's webinar will include a presentation by our panelists, followed by a question and answer period. To submit a question, just use the right-hand side of your screen in that chat function. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Thank you for joining us, and with that, I will hand it over to Michael Byrd.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon or good morning to all of you. We are going to run through a slide presentation that hopefully will be illuminating in part, hopefully will add some certainty to the issues that are at hand, and also will generate questions as to how we can perhaps be more helpful with you in the future on this particular issue. I think there are certain elements that, regarding all the information that's inside of what you're going to see here. First of all, there remains an awful lot of uncertainty. There is some certainty on the tax side, but regarding all the other issues, we still are uncertainty dominates. Second of all, in terms of the Congress right now, the attention competition is very manageable. That is, getting to these fiscal issues, while I might say it would be easy, there's little interference. There is work going on immigration. There is work going on regarding gun violence, and there are reviews of certain nominees to replace cabinet secretaries. But other than that, the fiscal issues are very much front and foremost. Another element is that there's very little happening bicamerally. What is happening within the House by itself, or within the Senate, or with consultations with the administrations. I think a fourth characteristic is that what Jeff and I will be speaking to you about today, what we're trying to do is to define what all this means for the work that you have to perform, for your legislators and for your fiscal offices. And finally, I think we've consulted with Puxatawny Phil on what are the possible outcomes for all of this, and the only thing we were able to come up with is that spring will come earlier. On the looming cliffs, as you can see, March 1st sequestration, the 27th, the continuing resolution for the FY13 appropriation concludes. The President's budget is expected sometime in March, with the Congress having April 15th deadlines for doing the budget resolutions. The debt limit is breached again on May 19th, and could last all the way up through August the 2nd, which is also the last day before the congressional summer recess. And finally, there'll be reauthorizations all year long. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and who's going to walk us through the sequestration minefield.
Thank you very much, Michael. The first issue that both Congress and the administration will address, which is also perhaps the most pressing issue for state governments, is sequestration. Now, I just want to first provide a little background on what sequestration is and how we ended up where we are at the moment. About 18 months ago, Congress and the administration, after after President Obama and Speaker Boehner were unable to agree to a quote-unquote grand bargain that would achieve roughly $4 trillion of deficit savings over 10 years. After they were unable to come to an agreement, Congress passed the Budget Control Act. And as you can see from the slide here, Michael and I really addressed this with two pots. The pot one is discretionary spending caps, which in a few slides I'll provide what these caps are for the next 9 years. And what we can, in the sequestration portion, you'll see is the latter two bullet points. The Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction, which was established in the Budget Control Act, failed to come to an agreement in November of 2011. Thus, sequestration was triggered. And we are currently in the process of sequestration starting. It was supposed to begin January 1st of this year, but was delayed until March 1st. So a little bit more background on what DCA actually did. The first pot includes $917 billion in discretionary spending. If you take out the interest savings, it's $787 billion. For the second pot, this is where obviously sequestration takes place, and it's important to note that this is over 9 years. This is split evenly between non-defense discretionary and some small mandatory spending and defense spending. If you look at it between the next 9 years, it's all split. So each year there's roughly $109 billion in savings that will be achieved. In the recent fiscal cliff passage, the American Taxpayer Relief Act, it impacted sequestration primarily by delaying the start of it for 2 months. This delay provided $24 billion in offsets for just the fiscal year 2013 reductions. And this is achieved half through revenue increases for retirement accounts and half through reductions in the discretionary caps for both fiscal year 2013 and fiscal year 2014. So as I mentioned earlier, here the next graph shows exactly what pot 1 is, the discretionary spending caps for the next 10 years. And there's really 2 takeaways here. One, it's important to note that for, if we're looking at right now, and for fiscal year 2013, we have a cap of $1.047 trillion. And if you look at the last year, fiscal year 2021, it increases by almost $200 billion to $1.2 trillion. So even though there's savings of roughly $900 billion, the cap is still increasing. This is largely reflected on what CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, projected long-term over 10 years. And the second takeaway is that this portion of the Budget Control Act, this pot, is here to stay. In any recent negotiations between Congress and the administration, this portion of deficit savings has not been mentioned to be amended, modified, or edited in any way. One thing to keep in mind is that this is a cap. There is currently negotiations in the House to lower this cap for, there's been attempts for fiscal year 2013, and there will be attempts in the House to lower the cap by $75 to $100 billion for fiscal year 2014. So let's get into the details of sequestration. It's important to note that while about 76% of programs that go to state and local governments are covered or are non-exempt in sequestration. Well, this graph shows that even though 75% of programs are covered, only about 18% of the funds that go to state and local governments are included in sequestration, so a very small portion. So why is that the case? Well, most of the programs that are exempt from sequestration are the programs where states receive the most funding. This includes a majority of transportation, Medicaid, temporary assistance for needy families, administrative assistance for SNAP. Basically, most but not all entitlement programs are exempt from sequestration. And just a side note, if you'd like extended details on what programs are exempt and what are covered, you can either contact Michael or myself, or FFIS, Federal Funds Information for States, has this information. And in addition, the Office of Management and Budget released a report in September that has extensive details on programs exempt, covered, and their percentage of cuts. So are the programs that will be cut in sequestration? Now, these include
education, environment, human services, and public safety programs, and a handful of others. These cuts will be, it's important to note that these cuts will be applied by program, project, and activity. Agencies may have discretion over timing of the cuts. For example, the Department of Education announced that for most programs, it would take the sequester from funds available in July 2013 for school year 2013-2014, so they're able to delay the cuts by an extra few months. Some of the programs with the biggest cuts for fiscal year 2013 include Title I, Special Education, WIC, Women, Infants, and Children Supplemental Nutrition Program, and Clean Water and Safe Drinking Water Revolving Fund. The last line, which is important to note, is that the recent passage of Hurricane Sandy disaster assistance is not exempt from sequestration, even though it is emergency spending. Only a few programs in this bill were exempt, and that includes funding for Veterans Affairs and Social Security Administration. So what can we say about the other portion of sequestration, defense funding? The large portion that is exempt from defense is pretty much all accounted for by military personnel, which the administration took away from sequestration last year. The impact on states really depends on each individual state, what their defense contracting is, what their procurement level is. So obviously some states are going to be largely impacted by this portion of sequestration, others less so. The next slide gives a background of a little more perspective or context on how sequestration would impact funding for this current federal fiscal year, 2013. The main number that Michael and I have consistently said is states to expect about a 9% change from fiscal year 12 to fiscal year 13. And as you can see from the bottom line, this is even exacerbated if you go back a few years to fiscal year 2010 till 2013. It's closer to 16%. Now, with the recent passage of the American Taxpayer Relief Act, that adjusted that minimized the cuts that the programs will receive for fiscal year 2013. These numbers are from CBO. I know FFIS actually has similar numbers, and for FFIS states that for domestic discretionary non-defense, the cuts would be closer to 6%. And as again, these numbers are all under the assumption that instead of $109 billion in cuts for fiscal year 2013, instead there will be about $85 billion. So I think the question that we go from here is, what's going to happen with sequestration? What's the likelihood that will actually take place? The important thing to remember is that it is still current law. On March 1st, sequestration by law is expected to take place. On the other hand, it's important to note that for the past few years, everyone has been against sequestration taking place. If you look at the President's budget proposal last year, it would get rid of sequestration. Same with House Budget Chairman Paul Ryan and the Senate budget resolution that was released last year as well, all trying to get away with the sequestration. Now, if the last few months, the momentum to change sequestration, while still quite large, has decreased somewhat significantly. The perspective has really been if the federal government is going to achieve long-term savings, we already have $1.2 trillion on the books, and that's an area to look at to achieve these savings. And really in the past week, there's been significant proposals and plans that have been put out, that have been released, that would either adjust or modify sequestration. The President this week requested again to delay sequestration, and this would largely be offset by other decreases to discretionary spending and revenue increases for wealthy Americans and corporations. The House actually this week also is discussing a plan that would freeze salaries for members of Congress for 10 years and cut the federal workforce by 10%. This proposal would just eliminate sequestration for this year, fiscal year 2013. And finally, the Senate next week is going to will likely introduce a bill that would significantly modify sequestration for fiscal year 2013 by evenly divided spending cuts and tax hikes. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Byrd.
I think Jeff and I, fully realize that you're working with your members on their, budgets for the upcoming fiscal year, whether you do them on an annual or biennial basis. But back here in Washington, D.C., there remains a great deal of uncertainty about what's going to happen with fiscal year 13 federal funds. Right now, the federal budget is governed by what is called a continuing resolution, and even though that's federal parlance, that essentially means that there was no agreement on finishing up the appropriations work for FY13 back last fall, and so therefore they passed a continuing resolution, which means that essentially all programs on the discretionary side continue at the levels they had in fiscal year 12. However, by virtue of the discretionary spending caps that Jeff mentioned, the funding that is being received by your states, your state agencies, and by your local governments is a little bit more than 0.5% higher than it was in 12. Now, this continues until March 27th, or about the midpoint in the federal fiscal year. What happens after that is still up for grabs. Even though all its eyes right now are on sequestration, the March 27th date lies just 3 weeks behind it. What could happen is that appropriators could conclude their work and actually pass the dozen appropriation bills that they have to do each year. If they do that, that would eliminate the across-the-board increase of 0.612% and would replace it with actual appropriations on a program-by-program basis, which means you would definitely have some winners and you would have some losers. But right now the appropriators are very inactive. They did do some negotiation last fall, which they could return to, but where they're going is really a great uncertainty at this time. Now, within the appropriations process is a program that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Block Grant. It, too, is authorized through March the 27th because they haven't been able to agree to a reauthorization over the course of the last 3 years. In order for the TANF program to both operate and be funded, it must be extended or officially reauthorized. So for states, that particular program is sort of dangling all by itself inside of the continuing resolution. I should also note, if you really want to get into a little bit of federal budgetese here, the House appropriation bills actually, on the defense spending side, exceed the individual cap that Jeff had referred to back there, so that technically speaking, on the 27th of March, a sequester has to be applied to the overage, and reductions have to be made within the defense accounts in order to get them back to what is the cap number. That doesn't exist over on the Senate side in terms of the work they've done so far. So, I mean, I think your work is probably complicated in part by the fact that there just is no certainty at this time, other than the fact that the continuing resolutions in place to the 27th. Yes, they could extend that all the way to September 30th. That would be an option. Yes, they could finish all their appropriation bills, and then we'd have program-by-program information. Or they could do nothing, and if they do nothing, then it's a government shutdown. On that happy note, I will pass it back to Jeff for the 2014 picture.
Thank you, Michael. Well, it is somewhat unique that this year, when we're still trying to address fiscal year 2013 spending, fiscal year 2014 is already under the microscope. And this is largely due to recent legislation, the No Budget, No Pay Act, which altered the debt limit, also had a provision that both the House and Senate must complete their budget resolutions by April 13th, or else they'd forego their compensation. So as you would imagine, this has provided extra emphasis for both the House and Senate to abide by their deadline to achieve their budget resolutions by the 15th of May. It's also important to note that the President typically releases his budget proposal the first week of February. That deadline has come and passed without the proposal at our disposal, and this is largely due to the fiscal cliff and the inability for the Office of Management and Budget to pass back their discretionary limits for each federal agency. So that process is currently going on now, and it is reported that the President will release his budget plan sometime in early to mid-March. As far as the House and Senate budget resolutions, as I mentioned earlier, the House is trying to achieve extra deficit savings below the cap for fiscal year 2014, upwards of $73 billion compared to from 13 to 14. And this is in an effort to balance the federal budget within 10 years. In previous proposals released by House Budget Chairman Ryan, they tried to balance the budget within 40 years, not 10 years. And this is somewhat similar to plans by the Republican Study Committee that recommended additional spending cuts. In terms of anything else that you may see in the budget resolution, it's very likely it will mirror large portions of last year's budget resolution by Chairman Ryan. Most likely recommendations to change entitlements, perhaps a premium support plan, things to that nature was likely to be included in such a plan. Last week, Senate Budget Chairman Patty Ryan offered a 12-page memorandum. Patty Murray, offered a 12-page memorandum to members that would advocate for a quote-unquote balanced approach of both spending cuts and new revenue from the wealthiest Americans. Next, obviously the debt limit is, from the slide that we've shown earlier, is really the last issue on the calendar this year that needs to be addressed. This issue flew somewhat under the radar during the fiscal cliff negotiations, and many people did not realize that the federal government actually breached the debt limit at the end of 2012. But due to the Department of Treasury being able to use quote-unquote extraordinary measures, the limit was actually extended to the middle of February. So as previously mentioned, Congress passed and the President signed the No Budget, No Pay Act, which basically raises the debt limit until May 18th, which at that point the federal government's outstanding obligations will be met. Now, you'd assume May 18th, that's the new debt limit date. Again, that would be incorrect. That date will likely be pushed until early August, where the Department of Treasury will again be able to use quote-unquote extraordinary measures to push the debt limit to early fall. So what would be the state impact with the debt limit if they would potentially default? Well, one, the Department of Treasury would have to pay higher interest rates, thus impacting state and local securities. But something that a little more, perhaps more substantial, is the federal downgrade would pass down, and state and local governments would actually see their credit ratings downgrade as well. This was most notable in August 2011 during the Budget Control Act, where Moody's actually came out and said the federal government defaulted on their debt. Then correspondingly, 5 states, Virginia, New Mexico, South Carolina, Tennessee, and I believe Maryland, would all have their credit rating downgraded as well, as they have significant they rely on the federal government for unemployment benefits, and a high majority of their employees are federal employees. So this is another area where states really would be impacted by the lack of ability from the federal government.
Thanks, Jeff, and I think we should just inform all of you that each of these issues, whether it be the continuing resolution, the debt limit, the budget resolution, or anything else that sort of falls under the rubric of fiscal cliff, any one of these could be used as a tool to finally drive a large deficit reduction, debt management bargain that would add to what was accomplished in, earlier this year with the extension of the tax cuts from 01, 03, and 10. So, but the fiscal crisis that the federal government has continues. Continues to. And there's this slide that's up there now, sort of just very, very succinctly summarize the challenge that's facing federal policymakers. This hasn't changed much in terms of how much revenue is coming in versus how much spending is out there, and the fact that we've been at this for about a dozen years. That you've had 4 straight years of trillion-dollar deficits and 2 recessions during the last decade, one being the Great One, and that the recovery has been slow. In fact, I think the Congressional Budget Office yesterday reported that economic growth during calendar 13 is estimated to be about 1.4%. So it kind of stays where it's been for the last couple of years. And then you have the 2 political party agendas that don't necessarily mesh. There's a chart here that sort of lays out, and these numbers have changed, and the lines have changed a little bit with the tax reform legislation that was enacted earlier. But for the most part, I mean, in terms of past congressional and administration decisions regarding fiscal policy, the track that current policy is really on in terms of the decisions they make, that bold arrow that's driving down lower than any of the other trend lines is the one that the country is essentially following. Writing the course of that line is what all the debate is all about in terms of the issues that we've just raised, and all of this, what I call stuff that has been negotiated over the course of the last 26 months. Now, Jeff and I are celebrating our 26-month anniversary, since the Bowles-Simpson report, in terms of trying to track all of this and to assess what this means for states. And here you see a number of either negotiations or reports, in addition to all the white papers that have come out on deficit reduction. There has been no shortage of efforts, either by the Speaker and the President together, by the Vice President and his House and Senate counterparts, a small group in the Senate, a larger group in the House, the super committee that Jeff talked to about before, the Vice President and the Senate Minority Leader, and the 2 budget activities. So there's been no shortage of negotiations. There has been, very little success, along those lines, however. Now, the thing is, though, that all these negotiations have got common elements to them that I think inform the potential impact on states, and that is, they always are comprehensive. They usually talk about both spending and revenue and putting everything on the table. They tend to be bipartisan. They usually and typically only involve federal policymakers. And the notable missing ingredient in all of these is the impact on state and local governments. This one chart here, which is really a chart from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, just gives you some numbers. And this and the subsequent 3 pages are going to highlight for you what are some of the issues or sub-issues that have been offered up as potential negotiating points. So if you follow this chart here, I mean, Bowles-Simpson, which you hear an awful lot about because that was the President's National Commission, probably has the largest savings package of anything that has come to the forefront over the course of these last 2 years. Then you have a couple of other proposals that are here. There's no reason to spend a lot of time on these except for the fact that they do identify some of the negotiating chips that have been placed on the table, some of which, not necessarily all of which, have some potential impact on state-federal relationships and funding that your states may be anticipating receiving. This is one from last year as well from the Vice President. Finally, but to sort of sum them up, if we go to this next chart, you'll see major areas that have been under discussion where there are repercussions for the state-federal partnership. Discretionary spending, absolutely for sure. I think Jeff is absolutely right on the money that nobody is talking about removing the discretionary spending caps, which provide very sizable, nearly $1 trillion worth in savings over the course of the next 10 fiscal years. Virtually every negotiation has had components that either deal with provisions within Medicaid, within Medicare, or within other mandatory and entitlement programs. Tax reform, where state and local sales tax deductibility looms, tax expenditures where tax-exempt financing is located, and finally in Social Security, where there have been virtually every deficit reduction report that's been out there has talked about mandatory state and local employee participation. Now, I'm going to talk about 2 bookends now. And that is part of the cliff. I mean, the cliff that got all the attention back over the holidays was resolved by the enactment of H.R. 8, or the American Taxpayer Act, which generates approximately $620 billion in new revenue over 10 years. That has allowed the Congressional Budget Office to estimate that by virtue of that action, the projected deficit for fiscal year 13 is actually going to drop below $1 trillion. However, when you take a long-term look at what that did, because it essentially extends the tax cuts that were initiated in 2001, that becomes a revenue loser when you're just, counting apples over at the Congressional Budget Office of over $4 trillion. The sequester was postponed. It temporarily fixed the number of programs that the Congress tends to extend on either 1 or 2 year bases. So that was averted. And then when you get a little deeper into H.R. 8, for those of you who come from states where there aren't income taxes, the optional sales tax deductibility was extended to 2013. Qualified Zone Academy bonds, which a lot of states use for school improvements, was extended. And limits on itemized deductions for individuals were reinstated. And inside of these itemized deduction limits, since these are done holistically, that means that individuals who are obviously in higher income bracket will have limits on how much that they can claim. So the question that poses is that the preface for federal tax reform, and you could extend that question to was H.R. 8 the preface for federal tax and entitlement reform and the quote grand bargain? Well, possibly. Obviously, it's now law. You have both the House majority and the Senate majority working on tax reform packages. There has been a lot of talk about loophole closing or tax expenditures being put on the line. The president has offered up a 28% cap. that could be imposed on expenditures overall, and without getting into individual ones. This talk about tax reform does, generate an awful lot of questioning, usually across partisan lines about, well, which ones do you mean? Which ones are you willing to put on the table? How big of a package? And of course, this also leads into discussion about, is there going to be a return to federal tax reform in general? I mean, right now I would say that both the Ways and Means and Finance Committees are hard at trying to draft packages that won't be released until later in the spring. Whether or not that leads to big changes in brackets, which I think the House majority definitely wants, or whether it leads to a curbing of expenditures, which I think the Senate majority would really like to see, and the administration would like to see. But it's premature right now. But I think this work on federal tax reform continues, and will become more evident as to what is possible a little bit later in the year. I know there's a lot of pundits right now who are talking about that really that H.R. 8 actually doused any chances of doing further work, but there are many who are looking for a big tax reform package in order to do various kinds of work in the tax area. So that really concludes our remarks, and I think we're ready for some questions.
Thank you, Michael. Just as a reminder, if you do want to ask a question, on the right-hand side of your screen in the chat feature, just type your question, and we're going to try to get to as many as we can. Our first question is kind of a political question. I'm going to give it to Michael. Let me read it. I know this is asking for you to read tea leaves a bit, but is there anything you can say about the change in tone, direction, or sanity in the transition to this new Congress? In particular, any guidance to those of us planning at the state level?
Well, I think we're off to a better start than we were in probably the last two preceding Congresses. And I say that because of what appears to be and is proving to be some bipartisan work on issues related to immigration. There's some bipartisan work going on related to gun violence. The fact that H.R. 8 was able to pass with votes that came from both political parties. That to me is at least a signal that things may actually evolve more positively than they have. Obviously the November election is now out of the way. You still have divided government. You still have different perspectives on what it should be done in order to return to the fiscal sanity that the questioner is posing here. So I think right now this is a really good time for those of you in state capitals, both members and staff, to be talking with your delegations and staff at the federal level and suggesting to them about moving forward, what things are most important to you, and whether that in terms of what on either the spending or on the revenue side. Until the water is poisoned, I see less desire to go to the brink, as we saw in August of 2011, and I think in almost everything that led up to H.R. 8's enactment.
Okay, our next question, let me give it to Jeff. This is about congressional pay. If Congress does not get budgets approved by April, and let's say that Congress gets budgets passed by June instead, does the Budget No Pay Act do, number one, meaning they don't get paid for the month and a half, or two, they don't get paid for that time but will get paid once budgets are approved, so they actually are penalized, or is the pay just delayed?
So this question is basically asking if Congress put any significant teeth into the No Budget, No Pay Act. And that would be a complete no. Basically what happens if if a budget resolution is not passed until June 1st, the funds from April 15th to June 1st would go into escrow, and they would be paid at that point. If Congress does not if neither the House nor Senate pass a budget resolution in the next 2 years throughout the lifespan of the 113th Congress, their pay from April 15th, 2012 to the end of the 113th Congress would all be in escrow, and they would get paid at the end of the 113th Congress. So no, they will. The legislation does not have any mechanism for them not to receive their salaries.
Okay, next question. This is about the Marketplace Fairness Act. Any sense of whether or not streamlined sales tax or its equivalent will be included in whatever emerges in the next few weeks?
Let me answer this two ways. One, I believe this issue probably made more progress in the 112th Congress than in any of the preceding Congresses whatsoever. I think if they had gotten to the grand bargain on a deficit reduction debt management deal, this could have very easily made its way in there, that there's the support especially generated over on the Senate side. I think it shows us that the votes were for an extraordinary majority are there. Now, if you really feel the love on this issue, the legislation is going to be reintroduced on Valentine's Day of this year so that it will be in the mix, and I think becomes a topic for immediate conversation and for inclusion in any legislation that moves on any of the topics that Jeff and I have talked about today. So I think because of the work done by so many state legislators on this issue in terms of interacting with your congressional delegations and the administration, we're starting in a very, very good spot this year.
All right, next question. As far as budget preparation goes, at what point should we actually do something regarding federal funds and how states appropriate those funds? Jeff?
Well, I really think it depends upon the states. The federal government is really giving no clear sense of what is coming down the pike in the next 2 years and maybe even in the next 10 years for the lifespan of the Budget Control Act. So with this uncertainty, some states are putting extra funding in either rainy day funds or doing an interagency evaluation of how they would operate if 5, 10, or 25% of their funds would be eliminated. But overall, the lack of clarity coming from the federal government to states is quite dense, and it really just depends on the state if they're trying to put away extra rainy day funds until extra years in preparation of a decrease in federal funding that will likely come in the next several years.
Okay, our next question is a timeline question. Will sequestration cuts happen immediately upon hitting the March 1st deadline?
This really depends. Well, yes, cuts will start for programs and activities and projects will begin on March 1st. The only discretion that federal agencies have is some leverage to space out the amount of cuts. This is a specifically difficult problem for the federal government, as we are already halfway through the fiscal year 2013, yet the federal government has to determine what to do with or how to manage the $85 billion in savings or cuts until the end of October 2013. So several agencies, so as I mentioned earlier, the Department of Education is backloading their cuts until 2013, 2014. So there is some manageable activities that a federal agency can do to backlog the cuts.
Well, let me add to that, because I think this is really important. First of all, there is barely any guidance out there right now from the Office of Management and Budget to the agencies to direct them as to how to proceed. The activity within OMB has, however, accelerated recently as the potential for sequestration once again looms quite highly. There are, some programs where perhaps money was released more quickly in the beginning of the year, which would mean that that there may be less there and they'll have to move more quickly. OMB holds all the cards on making any exceptions or changing what is or is not potentially exempt when you get down to the hard questions about particular programs. And as Jeff has already mentioned, they have already made some rulings on education funding, on funding for the military and for some of the components of the Medicare program. So we could see more of these. But and there is also the possibility that the Congress and the administration will agree to a shorter delay on another delay on sequestration, which would once again pose for everybody, okay, now what do we do until whatever date they would pick after March the 1st. So all of this is, still hanging out there with some uncertainty.
Okay, next question. If sequestration actually happens and the 5.1% reduction actually occurs, is there or has there been talks about changing federal requirements for those grants? For example, Title I vocational rehabilitation grant money. If the feds reduce this program, will the feds give leniency for states meeting their maintenance of effort, or are states expected to pick up that difference for services?
Well, first of all, there has been no specific talk about leniency for meeting maintenance of effort. Obviously, if money is reduced by 5.1% and the state has to come up with some kind of a match for that, you would obviously therefore have to come up with less money than you're possibly anticipating. This is a really, really good question. Because, in all the talk about sequestration, it's all been about across the board, across the program and the project and the activity. There's no wiggle room whatsoever on the federal side. And I think you could assume right now, without getting into specific programs, and you've raised a good one regarding the Title I voc rehab money, that we may have to pose these, and in fact I'm going to take this one down, to the individual agencies, because perhaps this is one where we may require to get some guidance on the possible exceptions.
All right, thank you. We're going to end it there. And just as a reminder from Michael and Jeff that they're going to continue to keep you updated on the situation through Cap to Cap and on our website. So thank you to Michael and Jeff, and thank all of you for joining us today. Later we'll be emailing you a survey. If you could take the time to fill that out, we'd appreciate it. And also, if you wanted to see an archived version of the PowerPoint and webinar, that will be available on our website, www.ncsl.org. The next webinar in our 2013 Top Issues series will take place on Monday, February 11th. The webinar is entitled Criminal Justice, Reinvestment and Realignment. Please visit the NCSL website to register. Thank you all very much.